The moment my sister pointed her finger at me across that conference table, I understood something I had spent years trying not to believe. Blood does not protect you. It just makes the wound go deeper. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'll be reading every single one tonight. My name is Audrey Callum, and for most of my adult life, I have been two people at once. The version the world saw was a freelance grant writer. I worked from a converted spare bedroom in my house in Raleigh, North Carolina, surrounded by stacks of manila folders and the kind of organized mess that only makes sense to the person who built it. I wrote funding proposals for food banks, literacy programs, community health clinics. I attended board meetings in sensible blazers. People knew me as the woman who could turn a cause into language that moved money. That was the version I showed everyone, including my sister. The other version of me spent 11 years inside the Securities and Exchange Commission. I worked in the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations, and before that in enforcement. I had helped build cases against fund managers who treated donor money like a personal checking account. I had sat across from people who lied with complete stillness in their eyes and learned how to read what was underneath. I knew what manufactured paper trails looked like. I knew how wire transfers got buried. I knew which documents looked right, but carried wrong timestamps if you knew where to look. I left the SEC quietly in 2019. No announcement. No farewell dinner. I had burned out in the specific way that happens when you spend too long looking at what people do to each other when they think no one is watching. I went back to Raleigh, close to where I grew up, and I built something small and quiet that let me keep doing meaningful work without it destroying me. Sabrina had moved to Raleigh 2 years before I did. She worked in nonprofit administration, which was genuinely a coincidence. She managed operations for a regional foundation called Lakeview Community Foundation, which distributed grant funding to social service organizations across the Piedmont. She was good at her job. She was organized. She had a sharp instinct for people and a way of commanding a room that I had admired since she was 12 years old, standing up to our father at the dinner table. We were not close in childhood, not estranged, just parallel. She was 5 years younger than me, and we ran in different directions. She wanted people. I wanted systems. But in adulthood, with geography now the same, we had built something real. Sunday dinners, text threads at midnight about nothing. The kind of closeness you can only construct as adults because you choose it instead of inheriting it. When she called in the spring of 2022 and told me that Lakeview was looking for a freelance grant consultant to help with the federal funding cycle, I did not hesitate. I should have. Neil Price had been the chief financial officer of Lakeview Community Foundation for 6 years before I arrived. He was 53, polished in the way that expensive education produces, and he had the specific confidence of a man who has never been seriously questioned. He shook my hand at the onboarding meeting and told me he had heard wonderful things from Sabrina. He smiled with everything except his eyes. Joanna Mertz was the staff accountant. She was quiet, thorough on the surface, and almost completely invisible in the room whenever Price was speaking. I noted that early. People who shrink themselves that precisely around a specific person are usually afraid of that person. I started in May 2022. My contract was for a 12-month grant writing engagement focused on 3 federal applications, totaling just over $800,000. I had access to the organization's financial data as needed to support accurate grant reporting. Standard arrangement. I did my work. I wrote the proposals. 2 of the 3 were funded. And then in February 2023, someone transferred $2 million out of Lakeview's general operating reserve and into an account I had never seen, using credentials attached to my consulting login. I did not find out about the transfer by reading a report. I found out because my sister called me at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning and said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, flat and mechanical and careful, that the board had been notified of a financial discrepancy and that my name was in the documentation. She did not say she believed me. She did not say she was sorry. She just said the words and then stayed quiet while I tried to understand what she was telling me. 3 weeks later, I was sitting at a long conference table at Lakeview's offices on the 4th floor of a building off New Bern Avenue. There were 7 board members. There was legal counsel the organization had retained. There was Joanna Mertz in the corner, not making eye contact with anyone. There was Neil Price, composed and sorrowful in the way of a man performing grief. And there was Sabrina, sitting 2 seats down from me, with a file folder in front of her and her hands flat on the table. When the board chair asked if anyone present had direct knowledge of the unauthorized transfer, Sabrina looked at me. Not around me, not past me, directly at me. And she said my name. She said, Audrey was the only external party with login access to the disbursement module during the relevant period. She did not say I did it. She was too careful for that. But she framed it in a way that left exactly one conclusion standing in the room. I did not speak. I did not react. I had spent 11 years inside a federal enforcement agency, learning that the worst thing you can do in a room that has already decided something is give them more material to work with. I looked at my sister, and I started counting what I knew, counting what I did not yet know, counting how long it would take me to find out. The board voted to suspend my contract pending investigation. Lakeview's outside counsel sent a formal preservation letter to my home address that afternoon. The state attorney general's office was notified within 48 hours. By Thursday of that week, my name had appeared in a local business news brief. No arrest, no charges, just a reference to an unnamed financial consultant under review in connection with irregularities at a Piedmont area nonprofit. My phone rang 37 times that day. I answered 4 of them. Sabrina was not one of the 4. The suspension letter used the word pending for times. Pending investigation, pending review, pending legal assessment, pending determination of scope. Pending is the word institutions use when they have already made up their mind, but want the paperwork to catch up first. I had no income. My contract was frozen. 2 of the 3 grants I had written were now under administrative hold because the funder had been notified of the irregularity and wanted assurance that the recipient organization's financial controls were intact. $812,000 in approved funding, sitting in a queue, not moving because my name was attached to the paperwork. The organizations waiting on that money ran an after-school tutoring program in Durham, a mobile dental clinic for uninsured adults in Guilford County. I thought about them more than I thought about myself in those first 2 weeks. I called a lawyer on the 4th day. Her name was Patricia Ondell, and she had spent 20 years doing white-collar defense work in the Middle District of North Carolina. I found her through a former SEC colleague who told me she was the kind of attorney who reads the actual documents instead of delegating everything and then billing you for the delegation. Patricia read the preservation letter. She read the board suspension notice. She read the brief summary of the alleged transfer that Lakeview's counsel had provided. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and asked me to tell her everything I knew about the disbursement module. I told her all of it, my access level, when I had used it, what for, and critically that I had never initiated a transfer of any kind because my consulting role did not require transfer authorization and I had never been granted that permission in writing. She made notes. She asked me to pull every email, every login confirmation, every access notification I had received during my engagement. I told her I had already printed them before coming to her office. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, good. The problem was that the documentation Lakeview's counsel had shared with the board told a different story. According to their records, my login credentials had been used to access the disbursement module on February 9th at 11:22 in the evening. A transfer authorization request had been submitted from that session. Joanna Mertz had countersigned as the required second approver. The funds, $2 million even, had moved to an account registered to a consulting entity called Price Meridian Consulting. I had not seen the name Price Meridian Consulting before that meeting with Patricia. It took me less than 30 seconds after she showed me the document to recognize whose name was embedded in it. I did not say anything out loud. I wrote it down on the legal pad she had given me and underlined it twice. Patricia noticed. She asked if that name meant something to me. I told her it might. I told her I needed a few days to look at some things before I said more. She told me that was not typically how attorney-client relationships worked. I told her I understood. but that I had spent over a decade learning that the first person who talks in a room full of incomplete information usually ends up providing the rope they get tied with. She thought about that. Then she told me to take my few days, but to call her immediately if anyone from law enforcement made contact. The calls from former colleagues started around day 10. Not the professional ones, the personal ones. People I had worked with at the SEC who had read the news brief and were now doing the calculation in their heads about whether association with me was something they could afford. Most of them did not call to offer support. They called with the careful language of people building distance, checking in, thinking of you. If there is anything I can do, which is the thing people say when they have already decided there is nothing they will do. 2 people called and meant it. One was a woman named Carolyn Dade, who had been my supervisor during my last 2 years at the commission. She called from a blocked number and said only that she believed me and that she was sorry this was happening. She did not ask for details. She did not offer advice. She just said those words and then said she had to go. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that. The other was a man named Theodore Burr who had worked enforcement alongside me for 6 years and who now ran a private financial investigations firm in Charlotte. Teddy did not say he believed me. He said something more useful. He said, "Tell me what you have and I'll tell you if it's enough to work with." I told him what I had. He told me to keep going. Meanwhile, Sabrina had stopped returning my calls. Not immediately. For the first week, she had picked up twice. Both conversations lasted under 3 minutes and felt like talking to someone who was reading from a script they did not write. She told me she was required to cooperate with the board's investigation. She told me she hoped it would get sorted out. She said the word hope the way people say it when they mean the opposite. On the 11th day, I drove to her apartment. She lived 12 minutes from me in a complex off Falls of Noose Road. I had been there dozens of times. I had a key she had given me 2 years earlier for emergencies. I did not use the key. I knocked. She opened the door and looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment I saw something I had not expected. She was not cold. She was not hostile. She was afraid. Not of me. Of something behind her that I could not yet see. I asked her if I could come in. She said she did not think that was a good idea. I asked her, quietly and directly, if she knew what was actually in that transfer documentation. She looked at the floor. Then she said, "Audrey, I cannot talk to you right now." I said, "Cannot or will not." She closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked back to my car and drove home and sat at the desk in my spare bedroom and opened my laptop. Sabrina was afraid. That was new information. People who are simply compliant with a story they constructed do not look afraid when the person they targeted shows up at their door. They look defensive. They look certain. They look like they are waiting for you to absorb the damage they have dealt. Sabrina had looked like someone standing at the edge of something she could not get out of. I had seen that look before. I had seen it on witnesses. I had seen it on people who were not the architects of a fraud, but who had become entangled in one and then discovered that the person who entangled them had more leverage than they had anticipated. I started writing a list, not of what I knew, of what Sabrina would have to know in order to be in the position she was in. If she had not constructed the fraud, she had at minimum provided something to whoever did. Access, information, context, something that made my credentials the logical fall target. And whoever had pointed her at me had to have something on her in return. Something that made cooperation feel like the only option. I did not have enough yet, but I was starting to see the shape of it. The Attorney General's office sent a formal inquiry to Patricia on day 14. No charges, not yet, but a request for documents and a request that I make myself available for a voluntary interview within 30 days. Voluntary is another word institutions use when they mean the alternative is worse. Patricia called me the same afternoon. She told me to say nothing, provide nothing, and let her handle the scheduling. Then she asked me again what I had found. This time I told her more. The first thing I did was pull the public record on Price Meridian Consulting. It was registered as a single-member LLC in Delaware in October 2021. Delaware because Delaware asks the fewest questions. The registered agent was a formation service out of Wilmington that processed several thousand incorporations a year and had no meaningful relationship with any of the entities it listed. The member name on the original articles of organization was not Neil Price. It was a name I did not recognize, Douglas Callum Price. I stopped when I read the middle name. Callum is my last name. It is not a common name. It is Scottish in origin, and I have met exactly 4 unrelated people with it in my entire life. The odds of that name appearing as the middle name of a shell entity connected to the man who appeared to have framed me were not odds I was willing to treat as coincidence. I called Teddy Burr that night. I read him the name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is not an accident." I said, "I know." He said, "Whoever built this wanted your name somewhere in the structure. Not to implicate you legally, that would be too obvious. Just close enough that if anyone started pulling on the thread, the name would create noise. Make it look like you had a personal connection to the entity." I said, "Or make it look like I was arrogant enough to use a derivative of my own name. Like I thought I was untouchable." Teddy said, "That too." I spent the next 4 days on public records. Delaware Secretary of State. North Carolina Secretary of State. The IRS Exempt Organization Database. Federal procurement records for every grant Lakeview had received in the past 4 years. I was not looking for the fraud itself. I was looking for the timeline of the fraud. When it was built. How long it had been running before February 9th. What I found was this. Price Meridian Consulting had received 2 prior payments from Lakeview Community Foundation. One in March 2022 for $48,000. Logged in Lakeview's financial records as a contracted technology assessment. One in September 2022 for $71,000, logged as a strategic planning engagement. Neither engagement had a corresponding deliverable in Lakeview's document management system. I knew this because Sabrina had shared login access to that system with me during my grant work, and that access had not yet been revoked. I documented everything I pulled from the system before I logged out for the last time. Screenshots with timestamps, file names, access logs showing my credential activity, which was limited entirely to the grants folder and the communications archive. Nothing near disbursements. Nothing near vendor management. The February transfer was not the beginning. It was the exit. Someone had been running money through Price Meridian for at least 11 months before the $2 million transfer, testing the mechanism, confirming that Lakeview's board review process was not catching flag vendors. By the time February came, they knew the pipeline worked. The $2 million was the closeout withdrawal before the structure became too visible to maintain. I brought all of this to Patricia. I laid it out in a sequence on her conference table, organized by date. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This is good, Audrey. This is very good. But I need to know how you got the document management system data before I can use any of it." I told her about the access. I told her it was legitimate access granted to me in writing as part of my consulting contract. I showed her the email from Sabrina in May 2022 granting me the credentials and specifying the permitted folders. She asked if the access grant had been revoked formally. I told her it had not. I had checked the system's user management log before I pulled the last documents. My account was still active. No termination notice. No access revocation. The suspension letter from the board referred to my consulting contract, not to my system access. Patricia said, "That will matter. Keep everything. Every login notification. Every access confirmation email from the system. We are going to need to show that your access was authorized at the time you used it." Then she said something else. She said, "The AG's office is going to try to build this around the February credentials. They will argue your login was used without authorization to initiate the transfer. We need to show not just that you did not do it, but exactly how someone else did. Do you have a theory?" I said, "Yes, but I need one more piece before I can prove it." The piece I needed was the credential access log for February 9th. My login had been used at 11:22 in the evening. I had been at home. I had not touched my laptop after 9 o'clock that night, because I had been on a call with a client in a different time zone that ended at 8:50, and then I had made dinner and gone to bed. I had the call records to prove the first part. I had nothing to prove the second part except my own account, which meant nothing without corroboration. What I needed was to show that my credentials had been used from an IP address that was not mine. I did not have access to Lakeview system logs. Those were controlled by their IT contractor. But Teddy Bird did have a contact at that contracting firm. Not inside. Former. A network administrator who had left 18 months earlier on poor terms and who Teddy believed might be willing to confirm, off the record, what the log structure looked like and whether timestamps could be cross-referenced against IP records. I want to be clear about what happened next because the line matters. I did not ask anyone to access anything they were not authorized to access. I did not ask for data that had not been properly obtained. What I asked Teddy's contact to tell me was whether the log architecture was the kind that recorded originating IP addresses by default, and whether those records would be preserved under a standard 30-day retention window. The answer to both questions was yes. That meant the log existed. It had not been deleted, and it contained the IP address of the machine that had actually initiated the session on February 9th. I filed a formal preservation request through Patricia, addressed to Lakeview's IT contractor directly, citing the pending legal investigation and requesting that all system access logs for the period of January 1st through March 1st, 2023 be preserved and not overwritten. The contractor was legally obligated to comply once the request was served. They complied within 24 hours. The next step was getting those logs produced. Patricia filed a motion in the civil proceeding that Lakewide's board had initiated to recover the transferred funds. She requested expedited discovery on the system access records on the grounds that those records were directly material to identifying the responsible party. The judge granted it. We had the logs within 11 days. The originating IP address for the February 9th session was not mine. It resolved to a commercial address, a building on Glenwood Avenue in Raleigh, not a residence, an office building. I pulled the building's tenant directory from the county assessor's records. Neil Price maintained a private office on the 3rd floor. I sat with that for a long time. Not because it surprised me, because I needed to be certain I was feeling it correctly before I moved forward. There is a specific discipline required when evidence confirms what you already believed. You have to be more careful, not less, because confirmation can make you stop looking, and stopping too early is how cases fall apart. So I kept going. I went back to the 2 prior Price Meridian payments, $48,000 in March, $71,000 in September. I pulled Lakeview's board meeting minutes for both months from the public record. Lakeview was required to post board minutes as a condition of their federal funding. The minutes for March 2022 reflected approval of a technology assessment contract. The minutes for September 2022 reflected approval of a strategic planning engagement. Both approvals had been moved by the CFO and seconded by the operations director. The operations director was Sabrina. I stared at that for a long time. Then I read it again. Then I called Teddy. I told him what I had found. I told him that Sabrina had seconded both prior Price Meridian payments at the board level, that her signature was on the motion records. He asked me how I was doing. I told him I was fine. I told him I was not fine. I told him I needed to know whether she had moved those motions knowingly or whether she had been handed paperwork and told to sign it without understanding what it was. He said, "Does it change what you do next?" I said, "It changes how I do it." Because if Sabrina had been used, if Price had given her documents to approve without disclosing the vendor relationship, then she was a victim with culpability. She had signed things she should have scrutinized. That was not fraud. That was negligence at worst. And at worst, it was the kind of negligence that happens to people who trust the wrong authority figures. But if she had known, if she had understood what Price Meridian was and had still seconded those payments, had still sat across from me at that conference table and said my name into a room full of people deciding my future, then something else was true. Then the door she had closed in my face was not fear of Price. It was the door of someone who had made a choice and was living inside the consequences of it. I needed to know which one I was dealing with before the interview with the Attorney General's office. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Joanna Mertz called Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon in early April. Not to speak to Patricia, to speak to me. Patricia relayed the request with a note that said only, "She sounds like she wants out of something. Your call." I said yes. Joanna came to Patricia's office the following Monday. She was smaller than I remembered from the boardroom. She sat in the chair across from me and put her hands in her lap and looked at the table for a moment before she started speaking. She said she had signed the counter-authorization on the February transfer because Neil Price had told her it was a board-approved emergency disbursement related to a federal audit compliance matter and that it needed to go through immediately. She said he had given her a signature page without the full document attached. She said she had asked for the full document and he had told her there was no time and that if the transfer did not go through by midnight, the foundation would be in breach of a federal reporting requirement. She said she had signed it and that she had known within 48 hours that she had made a terrible mistake. Then she said the thing I had been waiting to hear. She said that 3 weeks before the February transfer, she had overheard a phone call. Price had been in his office with the door most of the way closed. She had not been able to hear everything, but she had heard him say Sabrina's name. And she had heard him say she does not need to know the full picture. She just needs to stay quiet through the investigation, and then it resolves. She does not need to know the full picture. Sabrina had not built this. She had been handed a partial picture and threatened with the part she could see. The motion she had seconded. She may well have signed without understanding the vendor relationship. But by February, when the transfer happened, Price had made sure she understood enough. Enough to be afraid. Enough to say my name in that boardroom instead of his. I asked Joanna if she was willing to put what she had just told me in a sworn statement. She said she had a family. She said she was scared. I said I understood. I told her that the people who come forward before the investigation reaches them are always in a better position than the people who wait for it to arrive at their door. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, okay. I called Teddy that night. I told him we had enough. He said, then let's build the package. We spent the next 9 days constructing the evidentiary file. Teddy's firm formatted the IP log analysis. Patricia drafted the legal memorandum organizing the documentary evidence in sequence. I wrote the timeline, 31 months of Price Meridian activity mapped against Lakeview's board records, vendor payments, and system access logs, laid out so that any investigator could follow it without a forensic accounting background. We cross-referenced every figure. The 2 prior payments, the $2 million transfer, the account registration dates for Price Meridian, the building lease records for Price's private office on Glenwood Avenue, the board minute signatures, Joanna's sworn statement. The numbers held. Every entry was consistent. Nothing drifted. On April 22nd, Patricia contacted the Attorney General's office and told them that rather than presenting my client for a voluntary interview, we were prepared to deliver a complete investigative file implicating a third party in the fraudulent transfer and requesting that the inquiry be redirected accordingly. The investigator on the other end of that call was quiet for a moment. Then he said, send it over. We sent it that afternoon. The Attorney General's office took 11 days to respond after we sent the file. 11 days is not a long time in the context of a financial fraud investigation. It felt very long to me. I had stopped sleeping past 4 a.m. I would wake up in the dark and lie still and run the sequence of documents in my head the way I used to do before major enforcement actions at the SEC, checking for the thing I might have missed, the single inconsistency that could unravel the structure we had built. I did not find one, but the absence of a flaw is not the same as certainty, and I had learned a long time ago not to confuse the two. Patricia called on the morning of May 3rd. She told me the AG's office had opened a parallel criminal referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Charlotte. She told me that Lakeview's board had been notified that the investigation had identified a new primary subject and that my suspension was being reviewed. She told me to stay home that day and not speak to anyone without her present. I asked her what staying home was going to accomplish. She said, it is going to keep you out of the way while other people do the part you cannot do yourself. I stayed home. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Neil Price was contacted by federal investigators at his private office on Glenwood Avenue. I did not witness this. I know what happened because Patricia received a call from the AG's office as a professional courtesy, and because Teddy had a source inside the building who confirmed the sequence of events. Price had been in a meeting with a donor when the investigators arrived. 2 FBI agents and one investigator from the AG's white-collar unit. They asked to speak with him privately. He asked if he needed to call his attorney. They told him that was his right. He made the call. His attorney told him not to say a single word. He did not say a single word for the next 4 hours. What he did do, according to Teddy's source, was ask twice whether the foundation's board had been informed. Not his attorney. Not the investigators. The board. He asked it the way a person asks a question when the answer to it is the only variable they cannot control. The board was informed. By the end of that day, the full investigative file we had submitted, including the IP log analysis, the Price Meridian registration documents, the prior payment records, and Joanna Mertz's sworn statement, had been shared with Lakeview's outside counsel and forwarded to the board chair. The board called an emergency session for May 6th. Patricia told me I had the right to request to address the board directly. She told me it was not legally necessary, and that in her professional opinion, it was not strategically necessary either. She said the evidence spoke for itself, and that putting me in that room created opportunities for Price's attorney to raise questions they did not otherwise have standing to raise. I told her I understood all of that and that I was going anyway. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Then I am going with you." The board session was held in the same conference room on the 4th floor where I had sat 6 weeks earlier while my sister said my name. There were 7 board members again. Outside counsel. A representative from the AG's office observing as a courtesy. Joanna Mertz, who had agreed to attend and to repeat in person what she had put in her sworn statement. Neil Price was not present. His attorney had advised him not to attend, and he had followed that advice. Sabrina was present. She was seated at the far end of the table from me. She was wearing a gray jacket I had seen before, one she wore when she needed to feel contained. Her face was very still. She did not look at me when I walked in. The board chair opened the session by summarizing the investigative file. He read from it in the measured voice of a man who had spent the previous 3 days absorbing information that had collapsed the institutional trust he had spent years building. He read the dates of the Price Meridian payments. He read the IP log findings. He read the registration documents showing Price Meridian's formation date and the embedded name. He read the figure, $2 million. When he finished reading, he set the papers down and said that the board wished to formally hear from Joanna Mertz. Joanna spoke for 14 minutes. She described the evening of February 9th in precise detail. The signature page without the attached document. Price's statement about the federal audit compliance deadline. The phone call she had overheard 3 weeks earlier. Her voice was steady, and she did not look away from the board when she spoke, which I knew had cost her something because she had told me in Patricia's office that public speaking made her physically ill. When Joanna finished, the board chair looked at Sabrina. He did not accuse her of anything. He said, "Ms. Callum, the board would benefit from your account of the vendor approval process for the 2 Price Meridian payments in March and September of last year." Sabrina was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the outside counsel shifted in his chair. Then she said, "I was told the vendor had been vetted through the standard procurement review. I seconded the motions based on that representation. I did not independently verify the vendor's credentials or the relationship between the vendor and the CFO." The board chair asked her if she had received any communication from Neil Price regarding the February transfer or the subsequent investigation. Another long pause. She said yes. He asked her to describe the nature of those communications. She looked at the table. Then she said that in January of this year, 2 weeks before the transfer, Price had come to her office and told her that there was a documentation issue with a prior grant disbursement and that it was going to require a corrective transfer. He told her that the transfer would be processed through the external consultant's login because the consultant had the appropriate federal reporting credentials and it would be cleaner from an audit trail perspective. He told her that the consultant would be notified after the fact and that the board would receive a full accounting at the next scheduled review. She paused again. Then she said that she had not asked enough questions, that she had accepted his explanation because he had always been accurate before, and because she did not want to believe that someone she had worked alongside for 4 years was capable of what he was actually doing. The board chair asked her if she had understood, at the time she sat in the emergency board session in February, that the credentials used in the transfer belonged to her sister. The room was very quiet. Sabrina said yes. He asked her why she had not disclosed Price's January communication at that session. She said, because he told me that if I disclosed it, he would show the board the approval signatures on the March and September payments and represent that I had knowingly facilitated those transactions. He said no one would believe that I had not understood what I was signing. He said I would lose my position and potentially face personal liability. She stopped. Then she said I believed him. The board chair looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at me. I had been sitting still through all of this. I had not moved. I had not reacted. I had spent the entire session doing the thing I had trained myself to do in rooms like this, which is to let the record build itself and not interfere with it. But the board chair was looking at me now. And he said, Ms. Callum, is there anything you would like to add for the record? I thought about what I wanted to say. I had thought about it for weeks. I had drafted several versions of it in my head at 4 a.m. when I could not sleep. What I said was this. I said, the record is complete. I have nothing to add to it. I looked at Sabrina when I said it, not with anger, not with the performance of composure, just with the steadiness that comes from having done the work and let it stand. She looked back at me, and for the first time since the morning she had called me with that flat mechanical voice, I saw something in her face that was not fear. It was smaller than relief and larger than regret. I did not have a precise name for it. I filed it away to think about later. The board voted to terminate Neil Price's employment effective immediately and to refer the matter in full to both the FBI and the North Carolina Attorney General's office for criminal prosecution. They voted to lift my suspension and to formally retract the preservation letter that had been sent to my home address. They voted to commission an independent audit of all vendor payments processed during Price's tenure as CFO. Outside counsel noted for the record that the retraction of my suspension carried no admission of wrongdoing by the board in the original proceeding. Patricia noted for the record that we reserved the right to address that characterization separately. The session ended at 12:41 in the afternoon. I walked out into the hallway. Patricia walked beside me. Teddy, who had been waiting downstairs, met us at the elevator. He looked at me and said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. I said, like someone who just spent 3 months doing the job they left because it was destroying them and finding out that the only thing that had changed was the name of the person they were investigating. Teddy said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." We took the elevator down. In the lobby, I stopped and stood still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Sabrina was standing 6 feet away. She had her coat over one arm and her bag over the other shoulder, and she looked like she had walked out of that conference room without knowing where her feet were taking her and had ended up here. She said my name. I waited. She said, "I know that what I did cannot be explained away. I know that. But I want you to know that when I closed the door on you that day, I was the most frightened I have ever been in my life. Not of you. Of what would happen if I said the wrong thing and he found out." I looked at her. She said, "I am going to cooperate fully with the investigation. I have already told Patricia's office that I will provide a full statement. I want to give you that before you hear it from anyone else." I said, "I know. Patricia told me this morning." Sabrina looked down. She said, "I am sorry, Audrey." I said, "I know that too. I did not say it was all right. It was not all right. What she had done had cost me work, reputation, sleep, money, and 3 months of living inside the specific fear of a system turning against you with your name already in the paperwork. Those costs do not disappear because the person who contributed to them is sorry. But I also knew what I had seen in Price's documentation. I knew how he had constructed the trap around her. I knew that the leverage he had used was real, that her signatures on those motions were genuinely ambiguous, that a sophisticated operator had put her in a position where every option visible to her appeared to lead somewhere worse. That did not absolve her, but it made her human in a way that pure betrayal does not. I said, "Cooperate fully. Tell them everything. Do not leave anything out because you think it makes you look worse. The investigators already have most of it, and the parts they do not have yet they will find. The only thing that helps you now is being more complete than they expect." She nodded. I turned and walked out of the building into the May afternoon, and Patricia and Teddy walked out beside me. And none of us said anything for a little while, and that felt exactly right. The federal indictment came down on July 14th. Neil Price was charged on 4 counts: wire fraud, identity theft, misappropriation of nonprofit funds, and 1 count of obstruction, stemming from communications his attorney had made on his behalf to a Lakeview board member in the days immediately following our evidentiary submission, communications that a subsequent review determined had been intended to discourage the board from cooperating with the AG's investigation. 4 counts. The wire fraud alone carried a maximum of 20 years under federal statute. The identity theft count added a mandatory consecutive 2-year minimum on top of whatever the primary sentence carried. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at arraignment, which surprised no one, and the case was assigned to the Middle District of North Carolina for trial. Price Meridian Consulting was dissolved by court order within 30 days of the indictment. The Delaware Secretary of State's office was notified. The LLC's registered agent filed the termination paperwork without ceremony. The entity that had been built over 18 months to move money out of a community foundation and into a private account ceased to exist on paper the way it had existed on paper, quietly and without announcement, as if it had never been anything more than a line on a document, which legally was exactly what it had been. The $2 million transfer was subject to a civil asset recovery action filed simultaneously with the criminal indictment. Federal investigators had traced the funds through 2 intermediate accounts before they landed in a personal brokerage account registered in Price's name at a firm in Charlotte. Approximately $1.6 million remained in that account at the time of the freeze order. The remaining $400,000 had been moved in smaller increments into accounts connected to a property purchase Price had made in Carteret County in December 2022, a waterfront lot he had apparently been planning to develop. The property was placed under a lease pendens. The brokerage account was frozen. Lakeview Civil Counsel filed for full restitution of the $2 million plus interest and legal costs. The 2 prior Price Meridian payments, the $48,000 and the $71,000, were included in the civil recovery action as well. Those funds had been largely spent, but Price's personal assets were sufficient to cover the claim if the civil judgment went through, which Lakeview's attorneys believed it would given the strength of the documentary record. Joanna Mertz was not charged criminally. The AG's office determined that her role in countersigning the February transfer, while a serious professional failure, did not rise to the level of knowing participation in fraud given the circumstances Price had constructed around her. She resigned from Lakeview the week the indictment came down. She sent me a handwritten note 2 weeks after that. It was 3 sentences. She said she was grateful I had given her the chance to tell the truth before it was taken from her. She said she hoped I would find a way to keep doing the work I had been doing because the organizations that relied on it needed people like me. She signed it with her first name only. I kept the note. Sabrina's situation was more complicated and took longer to resolve. The AG's office reviewed her cooperation extensively. She provided a full written statement, a recorded interview, and testimony before a grand jury. She disclosed everything. The January meeting with Price, the phone call Joanna had overheard, the pressure he had applied during the investigation, the specific language he had used to make her believe that silence was her only viable option. She did not minimize her role. She acknowledged that she had seconded the Price Meridian motions without adequate scrutiny and that she had remained silent in the boardroom when honesty would have altered the course of the investigation. The AG's office ultimately declined to bring criminal charges against her. The determination reflected several factors. Her cooperation was substantial and had been proactive rather than compelled. The evidence supported her account that she had been manipulated into the approval motions without full disclosure of the vendor relationship. And the documentation of Price's pressure campaign against her was corroborated by Joanna's statement and by text messages recovered from Price's phone during the federal search of his office, messages in which he had told Sabrina explicitly that her signatures on the prior motions would be presented to investigators as proof of knowing participation if she did not follow his instructions. She had been trapped, imperfectly, with her own compliance as the mechanism of the trap, but trapped nonetheless. She resigned from Lakeview the same week Joanna did. The board accepted the resignation without a formal censure, a decision that drew some criticism from local nonprofit observers who felt the organization had been too lenient. I understood that criticism. I did not share it entirely. What I understood was that Sabrina had been made to choose between two kinds of damage and had chosen wrong, and that living inside the consequences of that choice was going to cost her more than any formal censure would have. Lakeview Community Foundation did not dissolve. I had wondered in the early weeks of the investigation whether an institution that had been used this way could recover. The answer, it turned out, depended almost entirely on whether the people who cared about what the foundation did were willing to stay. Several of them were. The board brought in an interim executive director and an interim CFO within 30 days of Price's termination. The independent audit they had commissioned was completed by September and found no additional irregular payments beyond the 3 Price Meridian transactions. The 2 federal grants I had written, the ones that had been placed on administrative hold, were released by their respective funders after the foundation provided a full accounting of the investigation and demonstrated the corrective actions it had taken. The after-school tutoring program in Durham received its funding in August. The mobile dental clinic in Guilford County received its funding in September. I found out about both disbursements from the public grant award notices the funders posted online. I sat with each one for a moment when I saw them. Not triumphant, just settled. The way a thing feels when it lands where it was supposed to land. My formal reinstatement as a consultant was accompanied by a letter from Lakeview's board chair that acknowledged the harm the suspension had caused to my professional reputation and expressed the board's regret for the role the organization had played, however involuntarily, in that harm. It was a careful letter, lawyered, but genuine in the places where genuine things tend to survive the lawyering. Patricia negotiated a settlement on my behalf with the foundation, covering lost contract income for the period of the suspension and a contribution to my legal fees. The terms are confidential and I will not disclose the amount, but I will say that it was sufficient and that Patricia earned every dollar of her portion of it. Teddy sent me a bottle of bourbon from a distillery in Chatham County with a note that said only good work. I sent him back a note that said, yours too. We have had dinner twice since then and have not discussed the case at either dinner, which is exactly how both of us prefer it. The criminal case against Neil Price is ongoing as of the time I am telling you this. He has pleaded not guilty and his trial is scheduled. I will not speculate about the outcome, but I will say that the evidentiary record is the most complete I have seen in a case of this type, and I spent 11 years watching cases of this type get built and fall apart and get built again. The IP logs alone are the kind of documentary evidence that tends to make trials shorter than defense attorneys initially anticipate. His waterfront lot in Carteret County remains under lien. I think about that sometimes, about the fact that he had picked it out while the scheme was still running, had presumably stood on it and looked at the water and imagined what it would become, had made plans in that specific way that people make plans when they believe they have already gotten away with something. The lot sits there. The water sits beyond it. The plans do not exist anymore. There is something in that I find clarifying, though I could not tell you precisely what. Now, the part about Sabrina. We did not speak for 4 months after the board session. Not because I had forbidden it. Not because she had stopped trying. We had both, I think, arrived at the same wordless understanding that some distances need to exist before they can be crossed. That trying to bridge a thing before it has finished breaking usually just extends the breaking. She called in September, a Sunday evening, which is when she has always called when she means something. I answered. We talked for 2 hours, not about the case, about everything that had happened underneath the case, about what she had been afraid of before Price ever entered the picture, and how that pre-existing fear had made her the right kind of target for the kind of pressure he applied. About what I had not known about her financial situation in the year before my engagement with Lakeview, a situation she had not disclosed because she had not wanted me to see her struggling. About the ways we had each been 2 people at once, her with her composed professional surface and her private precarity, me with my grant writer identity and the 11 years underneath it that I had never fully explained to her. She asked me why I had never told her about the SEC work. I said, because I did not want to be that person anymore when I came home. She said, I think I always knew you were more than what you showed me. I think I was afraid of it. I said, that makes two of us. We have had dinner 4 times since September. It is not what it was. I do not know yet what it will become. But it is honest in a way that our earlier closeness, the Sunday dinners and the midnight texts, was not quite honest, because it had been built on 2 people showing each other the versions they were comfortable with rather than the ones they were still figuring out. Honest is harder. Honest takes longer. Honest does not feel like closeness yet, but it feels like the right material to build from. I want to say one more thing before I finish. Not a lesson exactly. More an observation from someone who has spent a long time in rooms where people try to make the evidence say something other than what it says. The people who built this scheme did not think I would look. They counted on the fact that I had left the world of looking behind. They had seen a woman in a blazer writing grant proposals for food banks and had made a calculation about what she was capable of. That calculation is the oldest mistake in the architecture of fraud. You assess the person in front of you, and you miss the person underneath. You see the vocation, and you forget the formation. You think that because someone has stepped away from a particular kind of work, the work has also stepped away from them. It does not work that way. The skills do not leave. The pattern recognition does not leave. The specific discipline of sitting across from a manufactured story and asking where the timestamps do not match, that does not leave. What leaves is the willingness to use it every day. What leaves is the appetite for the grind of it. What leaves is the tolerance for the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who sees what everyone else has been arranged not to see. But when it matters, when it is your name on the document, when it is your sister's voice delivering the line, when it is your life inside the paperwork, it comes back. Every bit of it. Faster than you expect. Cleaner than you remember. And the people who built the trap discover too late that the person they chose to put inside it was exactly the wrong person. That is not a lesson I would wish on anyone. But it is the one this story gave me, and I have decided to keep it.